Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Unsustainable Remodeling, Broken TPRM in Healthcare. Thank you all for joining us today. We'd like to make today's session as interactive as possible. So before you get started, I would like to run through a couple of items so everyone knows how to participate. Everyone will have the opportunity to submit questions by clicking on the questions pane of the WebEx control panel. You can submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. The presentation portion should take about 45 to 60 minutes, which will leave us with about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session. If we happen to run out of time, we'll reach out to address any unanswered questions after the webinar. We will be recording today's webinar, and we will share the recorded version in our follow-up email. Now let's get started. To begin, I'd first like to welcome our speakers today, Britton Burton and Ryan Patrick. Britton, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thanks so much, Jess. So hi, everyone. My name is Britton Burton. I'm the Senior Director of Product Strategy at CORL Technologies. I'm fairly new in this role, less than a year in. Basically have spent the last 10 years in my career as a senior leader in cybersecurity at HCA Healthcare. I had different responsibilities from operational security to third-party risk management, and then spent the last 4 years at the enterprise level, responsible for cybersecurity and privacy risk management for the whole enterprise. So basically, my role is to be the practitioner within the product team who keenly understands the problem we're up against in the third-party risk space. Knows what solutions we need to develop to solve them, and work with our product team to bring cool products to market that solve problems for folks like you and me. And I'm really excited to be presenting today with Ryan. So Ryan, I'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Britton. Ironically, you and I have a similar background. So as mentioned, Ryan Patrick, Vice President of Adoption here at HITRUST. I have been with HITRUST just over a year now, but prior to that, I had worked for several different external assessor firms, helping organizations adopt and ultimately work towards certification against the HITRUST framework. So my role here at HITRUST is very much about education, dabble in consulting with customers as well as assessors and other entities to really understand what HITRUST brings to bear, but also take feedback from the industry and bring that back internal to what HITRUST is doing and try to improve the products and services. So similar to Britton, I have a practitioner's mind when it comes to HITRUST because I couldn't even tell you how many organizations varying from a two-person shop all the way up to multi-billion-dollar conglomerates adopt the framework and ultimately get certified. So really, really excited to be here today. Little known fact, or possibly little known fact, Britton actually hosts a monthly podcast where he's talking about all things relevant, trending security topics. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I recommend you do that. I'm just, happy to be a part of this conversation with that rock star over there. So thank you.
Thank you both. Today, CORL and HITRUST are joining forces to unpack exactly how and why today's healthcare TPRM approaches fall short. Then together, Britton and Ryan will propose tangible solutions to each of these challenges that will enable a more effective and sustainable future for healthcare and its vast third-party community. During our 60-minute session, we'll cover the perfect storm in healthcare's third-party landscape, 7 unsustainable problems with the healthcare TPRM, the foundation of a more sustainable approach, and how CORL and HITRUST are collaborating for a better future. I'll pass it over to Britt and Ryan to get us started.
All righty. Thanks so much, Jess. Yeah, so let's jump in. So as you can tell from the title, there's one word that we believe describes the state of TPRM in healthcare today, and that is unsustainable. We also have used the word broken a lot when we talk about it. And the reason that those two words, those are powerful words, those are strong words, right? But the reason that we talk about those two words is the number of third parties, more and more health systems, payers, the healthcare providing public, so to speak, is relying on third parties for more and more critical business operations. It makes sense to outsource. It's more efficient. It's more cost effective. Third parties are getting better at the services and technologies they provide. And so this growing number of third parties, every year it gets bigger. And I don't think anyone believes that trend line is going to start to go down all of a sudden. There are more incidents, despite the fact that we're assessing more and there's more focus on the need for TPRM. Every single year, the number of incidents that generate from third parties goes up. I believe for the second year in a row, 9 out of the 10 largest incidents, healthcare security incidents actually originate from a third party rather than in a health system itself. As you're all aware, probably from the new cybersecurity strategy that was released and other regulatory ongoings, there are intensifying demands from a regulatory standpoint for what we're doing in the third-party risk space. And then the big one, constraints in basically every resource area, whether it be in procurement, whether it be in IT, whether it be in cybersecurity, whether it be in legal. There's just too many things to put your arms around as the customer of so many third parties. And so on the whole, this risk problem is growing, and unsustainable is the word we use for this title because we just can't continue down this current path. We all know it's broken. We all know that it's not getting better, really. And so we've got to kind of have a sea change in how we address third-party risk. Manual vendor security risk assessments need to be a thing of the past. Siloed data is no match for the volume of healthcare vendors we're dealing with and the velocity of the business and the threat landscape that is constantly shifting and evolving. So, if you're a healthcare security leader like I was, like Ryan was, you're aware of this. I think it helps to just articulate it though, and to go, hey, you're not the only one seeing this perfect storm, this problem, and know that there is a better way forward, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, Britton, if I could add a little commentary on the last one about strain on resources. I've seen a lot of conversations, articles pointing to the fact that in healthcare specifically, but I think it's probably more broad to other industries, there are a lot of CISOs and senior security professionals who are just leaving the security industry altogether because they feel like they're being set up for failure. And what does that mean to, in the aspect of this conversation is they're being challenged and given the accountability of solving this problem without the resources to do so. And we're going to get into, kind of the 7 pillars as we see it on what is making it so challenging. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind that CISOs are quitting. I mean, not even just moving to other positions, but they are leaving the security industry altogether because they are worn out and they are stressed out. And a lot of that has to do with the issues that we're going to talk about today. So I want to jump into some statistics, and I wanted to kind of give a very quick analogy before I jump into the first stat. So for any of the audience members out there, if you've ever been a motorcycle rider, you may have heard the term those that have laid their bike down and those that are going to lay their bike down. There really is no in between, meaning that it's going to happen really to everyone. You're going to lay your bike down, and there's lots of reasons for that, which I digress on. But 55% of healthcare organizations in the last year have suffered a breach due to third parties. So statistically speaking, everybody in healthcare is more likely to either personally experience a breach or have one of their third parties experience a breach. So that's trending completely in the wrong direction. It's not surprising when you consider looking at an additional stat that's not here on the screen, but 49% of organizations don't even have a comprehensive list of their vendors. They can't even begin to start or wrap their head around what risk those vendors are presenting because they don't even know which vendors are in their ecosystem. And it's not because they don't want to do those things, but the dynamics of the way businesses are moving, and Britton used the term velocity. The velocity that businesses are moving makes it really difficult, especially with larger organizations, to get really good insight into what the business is bringing in from a vendor perspective. So the cost of a breach in healthcare just continues to go up. 10.1 million. 5 years ago, I think, and I'm going to pull the number out of my head, but this is relatively accurate. It was right around 2 or 3 million. So it's continuing to trend in the wrong direction. So what have we been doing about it? Well, historically speaking, or at least in the last year, we've spent $23.7 billion on vendor risk management. And if you look at the stats that I brought up earlier, it really hasn't worked. And there's, again, reasons why, which we'll cover in future slides. But the time is now. It is right. Like all the data, for those data folks out there, the data is pointing to we have to do something about this. So it's not that healthcare is bad. Healthcare is not unlike other industries, but you have to think about the types of people that are attracted to healthcare. Healthcare folks, people who come to the healthcare industry want to help other people. So it's somewhat counterintuitive to really run somebody through the ringer and do your proper due diligence when all you want to do is improve patient care and patient outcomes. You couple that with the fact that healthcare hasn't been doing this very long. If you look at the military and the banks of this country, they've been doing, you know, security and figuring out how to protect assets for almost 250 years, basically since this country was founded. HIPAA was written into law 27 years ago. High tech, 10 years ago. Oh, I'm sorry, 14 years ago. The final omnibus rule is only 10 years old. And then if you look at some of the major breaches that finally got people to pick their heads up and say, we got to do something about that, it was only in 2015. So we haven't been at this that long. So there's still work to be done, but I don't want anybody to walk away from this conversation thinking that healthcare's got it all wrong. There's lots of good things that are happening. We just kind of need to bring it together.
Yeah, totally agree. A lot of things stick out there for me. I've certainly experienced the inability to actually wrap your arms around the number of vendors that you have and who actually has access, who can touch data, who can touch network, so on and so forth. That is a real challenge because of the speed. And then that $23 billion, that I certainly felt that frustration too. It's like we're doing all this work to try to reduce risk, to assess these vendors as they come through, and you can feel like, am I even making a difference? And as a professional, that's never somewhere you want to be. And I think that's kind of what leads to your burnout comment on CISOs. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So as we discussed, we'll talk through 7 challenges here today. You see them populating on the screen now. So the next several slides, we will deep dive each of these. So I'm not going to read them off to you from here. You can see them, but I think you can probably see just kind of from the headline, each of these are major contributors to today's third-party risk management problem. So we'll go through each one of those, unpack them a good bit, talk through them with you, and hopefully, as we go through, there will be things that resonate with your own experience and with things you're seeing in terms of the growing problem that is TPRM. All right, let's go to the next slide. The first issue we wanted to talk about is that everyone is overwhelmed, and I think probably that we've already mentioned a couple of things here that sort of support this point. The inability to know how many vendors you have or which vendors are most critical and are accessing sensitive things. The speed and the volume is really the main thing that I know I felt in my role. It just seemed like every day I got a new vendor, a new product, whatever that came across my desk, and I'm looking back at the queue of things we're still trying to get to in terms of performing assessments, and then you don't even talk about adding remediation onto that and how long that tail can be. And as we work more and more with vendors in the healthcare system, as we referenced earlier, to perform these critical business operations, it's so overwhelming to try to wrap your arms around it. And so everyone feels the pressure of that. Organizations can't keep assessing the vendors as they come in. They can't keep up with the demands. And then as a security leader, again, I can raise my hand, guilty. You can be the one who's in the seat of telling your COO or your CFO or your CEO, I'm sorry, we can't implement that product yet. We haven't finished our security process. And that is not a fun place to be, right? But how many of you have had to have that conversation? And again, just not the conversation you want to have. And that's just talking about pre-contract, sort of net new things that are coming through. The dirty secret that probably everyone can admit, at happy hour is the reassessment part. Are we continually reassessing our vendors that are already in the door, that already have products here with us? That's not happening in a lot of cases, and if it is, it's very, very cursory. There are certainly some places that are more mature than others that have gotten better at this, but it's just a really, really difficult problem to solve, and that adds to that overwhelming feeling of I'm never going to be able to get to all of this. I am never going to assess all of these. I'm never going to understand the risk posture of all these vendors. How can I possibly, solve this problem, mitigate the risks that matter the most to our business, to our operations? And that scalability problem is really where we all feel that overwhelming feeling with the TPRM problem right now.
Yeah, so Britton, I want to piggyback on something that you brought up, that reassessment process. That is a huge issue in healthcare, but I do have a good anecdotal story that it's not just a healthcare problem. Everybody's really struggling with this. And if you look at what the cyber insurance carriers are doing, they're doing their initial due diligence, and you could argue that that has room for improvement. But the ones that I've spoken to, they're not even doing that reassessment process. So you go out year one, you go through the application process, you get your terms, so on and so forth. Year over year, your environment has changed. Things are different. You're doing things differently. Your business has changed, but they're not going through that reassessment process, that due diligence to make sure that you haven't increased your own risk. And the result of that is, and some of you may have seen this article that came out back at the end of December, the CEO of Zurich, an enormous insurance provider, has basically come out and said that cyber is uninsurable. So we may find ourselves in the future where we don't even have the option to have protection or insurance on what may, and then, going back to the statistic of 55%, what could very likely happen to you as an organization. So I say all that to reiterate the point that the reassessment only contributes to the sense of being overwhelmed, and it's not just our problem, although we have an opportunity right now to address it and fix it. But getting on to the next point, the blind spots are glaring, and we touched on this a little bit already. So typically, because organizations are overwhelmed, security organizations are overwhelmed, they are prioritizing what they can do. And typically, that is, oh, here are my critical vendors. Here are my highest risk vendors. Here are my vendors that are getting PHI, and they're focusing all of their attention on those high risk vendors. And usually that's a very small percentage of the total vendor population. And there's still vendors out there that present not only low risk, but even moderate risk to their organization. And that moderate risk vendor may have remote privileged access to your environment. That's pretty significant. I know everybody's focused on PHI because it's the focus of regulations and what OCR can come and audit and fine you against. But we're missing an opportunity, which if you look at the Target breach, if you look at some of the other breaches that have happened in the past, those moderate risk vendors are actually presenting considerable risk. They just haven't been prioritized. So we really need to look at a holistic, comprehensive solution to make sure that we're not only risk tiering properly, not just one question, hey, do they have PHI? Okay, that's what we're going to focus on. But what are they doing for the business? What is the criticality of that relationship? Maybe they are providing high availability for your environment, and every minute that you're down is costing you money. That's a huge problem. So we really need to take a look at how do we get visibility into the whole vendor population, but also what do we do with the information after we get it? Because the reporting that we get is either non-existent or it's patchwork at best, and we're not getting a complete picture of what we should be doing and making intelligent decisions about our vendors. Right now, the relationship with vendors is more transactional in a lot of cases. And I've seen a lot of organizations who are doing this well start to build relationships and partnerships with their vendors. Hey, give me some visibility into what you're doing now. Let's make a plan on how to close gaps, so on and so forth. There's options there, but again, we have to prioritize and we have to figure out a best case solution to address all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually that dovetails well with the next problem we're going to talk about. We talk Ryan just mentioned risk reporting is patchwork at best. We have these massive blind spots. We may not really have a great way to even tell you kind of an overall risk posture of our total vendor population for a given health system or whatever. That leads, there's many other things that lead to this, but that is a sort of stepping off point for remediation not actually becoming a reality. This is another, I think, one of those kind of dirty little secrets that if you're living the TPRM life, but you don't really talk about unless you're talking to your peers. But again, I'd never want to do these and be throwing stones at our community. I do it from the standpoint of I can raise my hand and be the person who says, I failed so many times to actually ensure that, hey, I got that assessment done. All right. Hey, CFO, we assessed the vendor and here's what we found out about them. You may now proceed to contracting. But did we ever actually follow up and reduce the risk, especially those key controls or whatever it was that we were looking at to try to say, we've got to fix some things before we can enter into a relationship with them. And the reality is it just isn't happening enough. And part of that is a huge part of it is because of the overwhelmed feeling. I've got 40 vendors in my queue that I know I've got to assess that are holding up a contract. And I've got two people on my team who do this. And how in the world can I focus on remediation? And, there are tools that can help with that. There's automation that can help with that, right? But I want to piggyback a little bit on what Ryan said. This has been a theme that I've talked about with people like Matthew Webb at HealthTrust that are really trying to reshape the TPRM industry. And the adversarial relationship that we currently experience as security and risk practitioners on the client side with vendors who we are assessing needs to become a thing of the past, and it needs to be a partnership. Their remediation is not their punishment. Their remediation is something that we can help them with as the healthcare community, and that as we work together towards remediation and greater ends, we are kind of lifting the security posture of on both sides of us. The problem, as it is with a lot of what we're going to talk about, is just time, resources, effort, scalability, and there are ways that we've got to solve that we'll talk through today.
Yeah. So going on to the next slide, the next topic, if you will, is that the existing approaches are pieces of a puzzle that isn't really put together at this point. And I think a term that I think is useful is really finding a balance, right? So there's lots of tools out there like GRC platforms. There's these scorecards that you can get from vendors, which have their place. They're valuable. There's workflow management tools, but there isn't really a complete solution out there because it's not just about a tool and it's not just about right now your overwhelmed team on solving these problems and making sure they're doing their due diligence and clearing that 40 vendor backlog. So what we really need to find is a balance between technology, internal resources, and services, where the concert of those three things come together and alleviate the feeling of being overwhelmed, automate what needs to be done and can be automated, because if everything's done manually, as we all know, it'd be super, super painful. But you need that internal team expertise and know-how in order for all of this to come together. So it would be really simple for us to sit here and say, buy this tool and get this managed service, but without the the help of the internal team, the support of the internal team, and arguably a champion internal to that organization, it's not going to work. So we really need to strike that balance and find that concert of a tool that makes sense within your organization, a partner that is helpful and you work well with, there's an understanding, good communication, all the things you would expect and hope for, but also there needs to be effort and collaboration from the internal teams.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. And I think the root cause, going to the next slide, the root cause for what Ryan was just talking about is there's a lack of a gold standard in the TPRM space. He just touched on the different approaches that organizations are using. And, from one of our clients to the next, from peers that I, commiserated with when I was on the industry side, every organization does it differently. The approaches vary so greatly. On one hand, that makes sense, right? There's different organizations have they have different resources, different budgets, different risk tolerances around third-party risk. But that lack of standardization across the industry means that it's not only bad for us as the healthcare organization community, right? It's bad for the vendors. I mean, the vendors are just as overwhelmed as the healthcare providers are, because every new customer they encounter has a different way of assessing them, expects different answers. The simple version, maybe they two different potential customers ask sort of a similar control question in a slightly different way, and there are ways to solve that relatively easily that exist in the market now. But a lot of it is just no other client has ever asked us that before, or asked us to prove that in that way before. And vendors wind up having teams of their own people who just exist to respond to security questionnaires from potential clients, rather than investing those resources back into their own security program, improving their own security posture, and building a better program that customers down the road can accept and go, hey, I think they're doing the right things. Even in the definition of vendor risk, that answer varies significantly for organizations. Some would define it based on the business criticality of the vendor, although, as Ryan mentioned, I think that's actually a very underrepresented component of vendor risk. We tend to think cyber first, PHI, access, and so on, and plenty define it in that way. So even just the way we define what risk is in TPRM is so fractured, and hopefully with collaborating more with groups like HITRUST, who have such a presence in the community, we can begin to consolidate those definitions and that thinking a little bit more, because there needs to be a consistent approach to provide clarity instead of confusion for healthcare orgs and vendors alike, because we both feel the burn from it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, because there's really no standardization right now, it is really hard, and I'm specifically talking about the health system side or healthcare organization side as opposed to the vendors. It's really hard to understand your enterprise risk or your organizational risk across the board, right? Because we have a tendency to focus on vendor X, get them through the due diligence process, then go to Y, then go to Z, so on and so forth. But understanding the risk that is presented across the entire vendor pool, it's really, really hard to do when you're accepting HITRUST for X, you've got SOC 2 for Y, and then you had them fill out your proprietary spreadsheet for Z, just as some examples. So how do you take those three and understand that none of them encrypt any data, or none of them have MFA enabled? This is at the simplest level the biggest reason for what we call at HITRUST a relying party, those who are relying on the assurances provided by their vendors. Why we espouse the standardization, because it makes life easier. Now, again, that's not one person going through and looking at 600 vendors risk assessments. Clearly, going back to my previous comments, there needs to be an automated tool that can kind of highlight these things and point you in the right direction. Then maybe you have that partner that helps bird dog that for you. But moving on to the next slide, I mentioned that, vendor Z may have filled out a proprietary questionnaire, and that is probably the most common quote unquote assurance mechanism that's out there, but it's not doing what you all need it to do in order to establish trust between two organizations, right? A lot of times those are filled out by the salesperson that is trying to get the deal closed. Or they may give you yes, no answers because their security office is completely overwhelmed with the work that they have to do. It's also a self-assessment in the sense of you're just taking their word for it. So it's not validated. There's no independent body or entity coming in and checking that when they say, yeah, we encrypt data at rest. Are they encrypting data at rest? So it leaves a gaping hole in how much assurance or how much trust is being provided with that mechanism. So we really need to take a look at what is useful, what is beneficial, and then ultimately what is practical. So not every vendor can do everything, and I don't think Britt and I are here espousing a silver bullet that's going to solve every single problem. We're kind of talking about, more generally that this is happening everywhere and there are things out there that you can do. You may still have to make exceptions, but that's exactly why there's an exception process. So we need to understand, or at least agree as an industry, that the most common assurance mechanism is kind of not good enough at this point, and it's not sustainable based on the statistics that we outlined in the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, and just a little bit extra there. The benchmarking is such an important part of what we need to be able to do in risk management. And the more that we as the healthcare organization side rely on our proprietary 300 control-based questionnaire, the less we are able to benchmark vendors. The more we can rely on third-party assurances that show that what a vendor is doing against a common framework, and the more you can benchmark, for example, vendors that maybe have competitive products that your business owners might be interested in and might find a data point about how they compare from a security standpoint. Certainly not the defining decision point for how they decide, make those decisions to contract with a vendor. But I believe I certainly saw it in my role. It's becoming more of a conversation with the C-suite when making decisions like that. And when you can actually compare apples to apples, that's a really nice way to be able to talk risk with people who don't understand bits and bytes and cybersecurity details. And that just goes completely out the window when you're relying on your homegrown spreadsheet questionnaire or the traditional way we've done it, which is everyone kind of having their own, here's my 300 controls, fill it out and send it back to me. Not to mention the whole self-attested part that just that lack of trust that we think is a major problem in the industry.
Britton, if I could add one more comment on this before we get to the next one. There's another, as Britton has referenced several times, dirty little secret that even if you have looked at better or higher levels of assurance, whether that be third-party attested, certification, another, there's typically a lag time between when you ask that organization to pursue that level of assurance and when you actually get the results of that assessment. So because I'm, a HITRUST employee, and I'm going to sound biased because I am, if you ask an organization to do a HITRUST R2 assessment, for those of you who may not know, that is a significant emotional event. That takes time. That could take in excess of 12 to 18 months to get done. And what does that do for the relying party, the party that's asking for that level of assurance and that trust? It actually gives you about 12 to 18 months worth of no information whatsoever. So we need to close the gap between the appropriate level of assurance and getting near-term visibility. So whether it be HITRUST R2, ISO something or other, it doesn't matter what it is. There needs to be something in the near term that you can use to gain some immediate visibility that probably still needs to be validated to a certain extent. And again, I'm going to sound biased. HITRUST released about 2 months ago our new E1 or Essentials 1 year assessment. It's 44 controls, and these are the essentials. These are the absolute minimum. If you're not doing these things, you need to go rethink your life because you're about to invite headache or heartache into your world. So what that does for you, unlike pretty much every other assurance type that I've mentioned so far, is it's a quick hitter and it's the bare minimum. And what does it give you? It gives you that velocity. It gives you that visibility immediately, so that you can make decisions because you may find out that that organization is not encrypting data at rest. So it gives you actionable intelligence to work with your vendor and say, hey, I know I asked you to do this R2 thing and it's going to take you a while to get there, but I need you to implement uh, encryption for data at rest because that is a huge problem based on the way your security program is matured today. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's we don't have it on the slides, but it's a huge issue that I think clearly there's a solution for. I just kind of outlined it for you, but it's kind of like what you said, Brent, a dirty little secret.
Yeah, and the E1 is we're at CORL, we're really excited about it. It is kind of one of the linchpins of our shifting strategy around TPRM, where we are attempting to move away from asking our own control questions. Because if there's, first of all, if a vendor has assurance already, we need to embrace that. We need to fast track their ability to get to contracting because they've proven their security posture through assurances. But if they don't, if we can leverage things like the E1, that our goal is to ask vendors to turn those around in 60 to 90 days, and give you that immediate feedback, that give the client that immediate feedback of, hey, these are the table stakes controls. Like this, if they're not doing these things, if they can't pass this, so to speak, then you really have to consider whether or not it's worth doing business with them. And you may need to pursue further assurances down the road, as Ryan was talking about, but that E1, that ability to turn that around so quickly is really important to our strategy with CORL cleared, which is something we'll talk about at the very end. All right, on to the last slide in this section, the number 7 item. And this one is maybe the most frustrating one to me. Again, putting back in the practitioner's shoes of the blood, sweat, and tears that I would pour into assessing vendors and doing my best to push through the process, and the amount of money that's being spent in the TPRM space, and yet you walk away with basically no stakeholders being satisfied. A huge reason for that is the competing priorities. You see examples there. Business owners, they just want their new shiny toy fast so they can solve a business problem. They can provide better patient care, whatever it is. The CISO is wanting to prevent potential breaches down the road. Procurement has their process that they want everyone to follow, and I love the procurement people. They're one of your best friends, at least they should be, as a security leader in your organization dealing with TPRM. And the CFO just wants it all done at cost. And again, another maybe dirty little secret. We might be overusing that term here, Ryan, but this is kind of what this is about. This is hopefully cathartic for everyone. Maybe one of the 4 people in that example group comes away satisfied with the end of a vendor assessment process, but very rarely does it do more than one. And usually that's because the business owner managed to pull some strings and get something fast tracked through to avoid security, or the CISO got all their control questions answered and they know every single aspect of that vendor security program, but it took 6.5 months to get it done. And now we get to start negotiating the contract, right? You get what I'm saying there. And so if there's any other indicator of, TPRM is fundamentally broken, fundamentally unsustainable, this result of the process being every stakeholder is looking at each other going, I can't stand how this all came to be, how we got to this point. I'm not happy with what just went down. Man, I can't think of a better indicator So we've got to, in the midst of all these solutions we're talking about and continue to talk about the rest of today, satisfying actual stakeholders has to be kind of front and center with all those things.
Yeah, and I would add really quickly that in my opinion, this is probably the worst part. This is the thing that slows everything down. And if you look at the blue box at the top, competing priorities. So whether it's, a solution, a vendor, the controls as Britton outlined, the fact that there's so many people in the organization that you have to convince to get this right makes it so difficult.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move on to how we're going to shift our focus from the problem to the solution. So we'll be on this slide for a little while, and we'll talk through this. What is really needed to take the title of this webinar, Unsustainable, to change it to a sustainable approach to TPRM, and we'll walk through a few things that we think are critical and that we're collaborating with together to solve. So first of all, on the top left, widespread adoption of third-party assurance and the recognition of its value is immensely important. We touched on it just a moment ago. HITRUST is a well-established name in that area. They're working to accomplish this even further by outlining this achievable and progressive route to assurance. So Ryan touched on it a little bit. Ryan, I'll throw it to you in a second to talk a little bit more about that. Maybe E1 is this quick turnaround. I1 is not as comprehensive as the R2, but it's still very much more comprehensive than E1. R2 is the most comprehensive and can take 12 to 18 months, but really proves your security posture. And the more that we in the client world, in the healthcare org world, can rely on those assurances, we are proving that first of all, the vendor is proving their security posture to us, and we also need to do a better job of reciprocating to them. They pour a ton of effort into achieving these things, and we as a group need to be able to say, hey, you know what? As long as that's the right scope for the thing I'm buying, there's not a whole lot else I need from you. You have proven it through this. If it's current, if it's accurate, if it's the right scope, then let's see what we can do to avoid more question and answer from me as the buying customer for your product. All right, the next one, defining healthy security program indicators and cyber resilience is a must. One way CORL is doing this is by moving away from assessing vendors, I mentioned this, based on hundreds of confusing controls, and instead focusing on a select set of indicators that really matter. It's a much more well-defined approach that will make TPRM more scalable for everyone involved. It will heavily rely on assurances, and it will make that benchmarking concept so much simpler because we're talking about a handful of requirements that really state the maturity of a vendor's security program, as opposed to all the different variations and scope dependencies of control-based questions. Continuing to move on, there needs to be a movement towards making risk management a universal language. HITRUST and CORL are both a part of Health Third-Party Trust, H3PT, if you have not heard of it. It's a council that represents a really important step in the conversation amongst stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem. I think we've got a mix of vendor security folks and healthcare organization security folks on this call, and that is outstanding. That is what we want. H3PT is really what that is about. It's been very beneficial so far to hear directly from the stakeholders to understand their priorities, and we're very excited to continue that conversation. It's all about coming together and saying, we know TPRM is unsustainable. How can we work together to make it more? And Ryan and I have been teasing some things we believe that can make that happen. Hey, what if the healthcare org side agrees? If you've got assurances, we're not going to ask a whole lot more of you. Give me those, and that can have your security team focus on those assurances and building their program better instead of responding to different questionnaires every other day from all the customers you're encountering. So please, I believe that may have just been a link popped into the chat. If you're interested in joining that and shaping the future of TPRM as a collective group, and I do mean that, it is not just healthcare CISOs, banging on vendors and saying, do this. We are trying to accomplish this together. What is a reasonable approach that benefits us both? go to health3pt.org, and there's a Join Us button in the top right, and we'd love to see if we can get you on board.
Yeah, I'll add really quickly, Britton, that I'm personally pretty excited about H3PT. As Britton outlined, it's really the industry coming together to solve this problem, and they actually were instrumental. The group that we have now, which I think is right around 50 different organizations, they were instrumental in not only validating what we had here in this deck, but also massaging it a little bit. So their input helped inform this webinar today.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving on. Working together to solve TPRM across the healthcare industry is critical to a more secure and resilient future. So healthcare orgs, vendors across categories, and all sorts of other players in the cybersecurity space, we've got to come together to unpack this problem and ensure that new methodologies work for everyone involved. So collaboration is key. I hope that message just came across from Ryan and I, and that's why we're here together today. That's why we're doing things like H3PT. It should not be an adversarial relationship anymore. It should be a relationship of partnership. All right, second to last, a new reasonable approach to continuous monitoring and remediation is imperative. So as we mentioned, solving this problem doesn't mean stopping once a vendor has been assessed. It's so hard for most of us to get ahead of that, right? You're just kind of dealing with the new thing that's coming in. But it's really, really important to keep track of all vendors as requirements change, as their operations change, as their technology evolves. And at CORL, we're building what we call remediation pathways into our methodology, and then coupling those with pathways, with the operational approaches we need to ensure that they can be enforced at scale, and also the continuous touch points and the ability to know that that remediation is happening, but also if something has changed in the environment, does evidence that was provided previously need to be updated in some way? And then finally, standardization around inherent risk. That's another theme we've touched on already. The CORL and HITRUST are both really committed to clarifying what defines risk and tailoring assurance approaches based on the vendor's level of risk. Everyone uses this analogy, but just to keep it going, the lawn maintenance crew maybe doesn't need the same level of assurance as your cloud-based EHR vendor, right? There is a way to size these things, but there's a whole lot of in between from that lawn care group to the EMR, and that's where it's really hard, right? And so just having consistent approach, consistent conversation, consistent variables that are sort of understood to need to be included in inherent risk, like business criticality, which is so often left out. It's not just about, well, do they touch PHI or not? But being able to tailor that, I think, is just going to be really critical. And again, as we work through H3PT and through collaboration with the community, there's a way to set something there that makes sense for everyone, and can actually scale to the entire healthcare TPRM industry.
Jess, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so what are we doing? So we've been talking about this solution pretty much from the beginning, and I want to start off that the collaboration, the partnership between HITRUST and CORL is really designed to create a better, more sustainable future, and we're committed to that end to provide a solution that helps ease the burden, if you will. So if you take us kind of in two pieces, as the slide indicates, there is some overlap here that we're suggesting makes a good recipe. So HITRUST for 15 plus years has been a champion of providing assurance and trust. I mean, at the simplest level, people may think of HITRUST as this certification body, and people get certified because they want to show themselves and perhaps others that they're doing all the right things from a security and privacy perspective. But really, if you look under the covers, HITRUST from the start has always been about trust and understanding where organizations reside when it comes to security and privacy by extension. So this is not unnatural from kind of the origins of what HITRUST has come from. So we really have been focused, even though we haven't talked about it a lot, on that supply chain um, management for years. And then you couple that with the work that CORL is doing, and I'm going to pause here because I'm not the CORL expert. I'm going to pass it over to Britton. But CORL has a proven methodology that reduces the friction of third-party risk management. So if you recall my comments earlier about technology plus services plus, I'm sorry, technology plus services plus that internal team, CORL is that services arm. And oh, by the way, I believe they have a technology to help solve this problem. So, using HITRUST as the standard and using CORL as the mechanism or the enforcement arm, if you will, for lack of a better term, that's really what we're talking about here. And it seems like a really natural relationship in my mind. And, you know, I digress because I want, Britton to talk about exactly what CORL is doing from a CORL cleared perspective, because I am not the expert.
Yeah, thanks, right. And you can go on to the next slide there, Jess. So at CORL, we bring together the best combination of modern technology and human-backed services to focus on vendor risk management. Go ahead and hit it one more time. I think it's hung there, Jess. And we are specifically focused on the healthcare space. We are highly tailored to the nuances of this ecosystem. We've been around about 12 years. That is always been our bailiwick. We have a handful of non-healthcare clients, but for the most part, we really focus on healthcare. All of our practitioners, as you've heard me talk about, come from healthcare backgrounds, CISOs, directors of security, and so on. And we're really committed to enabling velocity and validation that healthcare organizations need to achieve those digital goals, but while containing digital risk. And so to support the sea change that we've been talking about today, we're very excited to announce our new TPRM methodology that we call CORL Cleared. So CORL Cleared, think about TSA pre-check at the airport. The goal here is to fast track people who are vendors who are doing the right things through the security due diligence process. CORL Cleared aims to transform the chaos of traditional TPRM security questionnaires by consolidating hundreds of control-based questions into a small set of key requirements that, if maintained, if consistent, if current, if accurate, prove a vendor as suitable for contracting. And so with this approach, we believe we can achieve the breadth of vendor population coverage that's needed without sacrificing the depth of security due diligence. And that last point is really important, right? And the reason that we believe we can do that is because our number one priority requirement to be CORL cleared, to proactively clear vendors who may not ever have to be assessed if they can meet these requirements from one engagement to the next. The number one requirement, the number one priority requirement we have is the assurance offered by validated assessment and certification. And with our HITRUST remediation pathway, basically what we'll do is help all of our clients validate, first, does a HITRUST assessment exist at all? If it does, hey, that's great. You are probably just about done. There's a couple of other operational details we want to collect on that vendor to make sure we understand it, but the scope and some things like fourth party vendors that may be involved in their operation, right? But if you've got that HITRUST assessment, we're pretty close to being done. If that assessment exists, great, right? If it doesn't, CORL will negotiate on the client's behalf with that vendor to adopt the HITRUST pathway and start with the E1, start with that lowest level. Can we turn that around in 60 to 90 days? Can we show, hey, they're meeting the baseline, they've got these table stakes controls and they're all in pretty good shape. That's a pretty good indicator. Yeah, we still may want them to move further along, but that's a pretty good indicator that we can do business. Or, whoa, they're not even close on the E1, and that's some scary stuff to not be close on. And then using the CORL cleared platform, use automation to monitor progress along the way of that remediation pathway through incremental progress indicators in 60 to 90 day intervals that show their progress, that they're continuing to progress, so that you can maintain sort of a contract suitability on your end of, hey, they're continuing to work in good faith. And then confirm final status and even do things like initiate reassessments when certification expiration dates come up. So that's the tangible what Ryan was getting at with like enabling the operational capability. we're relying on HITRUST for the rigor, the prove that you've got a strong security program. We don't necessarily want to be in that space. HITRUST is great at that. What we do want to do is help customers, operationalize getting their vendors to that state and progressing them along the appropriate pathway from E1 to I1 to R2 if R2 is necessary because they're at a level of inherent risk that sort of demands it. So Ryan, that's my spiel on CORL cleared. Appreciate you throwing it to me. Feel free to do the same about HITRUST if you'd like.
Yeah, so I'm definitely gonna get the recording of this and just kind of repeat that constantly because that was great. So in the spirit of time consideration, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on all the things that HITRUST is doing because I definitely want to give some time for questions. But at the simplest level, HITRUST is committed to maintaining its relevancy. So unlike other frameworks, HITRUST is committed and guarantees the framework will be updated at least on an annual basis. And a lot of times, a lot of cases, we're updating it more frequently. So the relevancy of our controls is at a much more significant pace than other frameworks and arguably regulations out there today. So you couple that with the fact that with our new version 11 that came out in mid-January, the entire assessment portfolio, the E1 we've been talking about, we mentioned the I1, and I think most people in healthcare know about the R2. The entire portfolio at this point is considered cyber threat adaptive. So what HITRUST is doing on a quarterly basis is we are ingesting a threat feed from Forescout and bumping that up against the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then mapping that to the controls in the E1 and then into the I1, which because the E1 is nested into the controls of the I1 and the I1 is nested into the controls of the R2, the entire portfolio is representative of the threats that are happening today. So on that quarterly analysis, if we determine that there is a control that's currently not in the control set for the E1, I1, or R2, we will insert that control into the control set so organizations who are utilizing HITRUST are protecting themselves against, the biggest and most common threats that are happening in the wild today. So I'll leave you all with the platform, with the assessment portfolio. There is relevancy and rigor as we've mentioned, because even the E1, it's 44 controls, which was primarily built off of some of that cyber threat analysis. There's some sprinkling in of NIST. It follows the same rigor as the R2 assessment from a quality perspective and a testing perspective. So our assessors are still required to follow our testing methodology, our sampling requirements. They still have to do all the QA on their end, and then it goes through the rigor of the HITRUST QA on the back end for every single assessment.
All right. Outstanding, Ryan. I know we're pretty close to time, but Jess, we can probably try to squeeze at least one question in if we have something before we end it.
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. Britton, I'll kick this one off to you first. For those TPRM programs that lack any assurance expectations within their culture, do organizations still think it's worth risking the breaches and handling their data?
That's an interesting question. I think I'd be curious to talk more to the person that submitted this. When you say, they kind of lack the culture of expecting assurances, I wonder if that's just maybe a sign of maturity. I know that sometimes as we talk to customers and potential customers, the ones who have not really embarked on we're going to solve this TPRM problem, let's go do it, and they start developing their own questionnaires, or they buy the different tools, or they hire up staff. Before they've done that and they've seen that, like, wow, it kind of doesn't matter what we do, we're not going to be able to do this. Those are the scars you develop, the scar tissue you develop through trying to do that yourself. I think you begin to come around to that there's almost no other way to do this than to rely on assurances. How can we rely more on assurances and ask less questions? So I'd be curious to talk to whoever sent that in. Would love to connect with you and hear more about where that's coming from. But in my experience, that is more of a maturity thing where you think this isn't that big of a problem. We can solve it kind of the old way. And that may lead to some of that. We don't really need assurances culture that you're talking about.
Cool. We'll do one more. Ryan, I'll give you this one. As a vendor, I spend nearly 70% of my time answering security questionnaires from customers despite HITRUST SOC 2 and ISO 27001 certifications. Is there anything I can do more effectively to more effectively communicate our security up front and preempt these questionnaires?
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately not too uncommon. So typically what I found is it's usually an education issue for the relying party. They don't understand the rigor, specifically with HITRUST, but even ISO and to a certain degree SOC 2, the rigor that is within the assessment process and the way the assessment works itself, that they just default to what they're familiar with, it, which is usually their proprietary questionnaire. So I see a lot of educational gaps, and we at HITRUST are actually happy to help all of our customers meet with those relying parties that educate them on how to understand and interpret the results of a HITRUST assessment. I would also throw out and arguably pitch, this is exactly what H3PT is trying to solve. So I encourage you to get out there, check out health3pt.org and join the movement.
Yeah, and I'll jump into that one too, Ryan. And I would love to connect with whomever submitted this one too. That what you just described. I have all these certifications. We're doing the right things, but I still spend almost every day of the week responding to these questionnaires from potential clients. That is why CORL Cleared was born. What we are doing is signing up clients to say, you know what, we are going to end the chaos. We are going to accept these requirements that CORL Cleared has set. Again, the most important of which is the security assurance. And we're not going to ask for more if they can prove that they have those things, that are well scoped to what it is that we're buying. And then also proactively on the vendor side, if you're, in a security role at a vendor, you can proactively come to us and say, I'd like to be CORL Cleared. And every client that you have that I encounter, I don't ever want to answer a questionnaire again. That is what we are trying to do. So would love to talk to you more about that, because that is, as I mentioned, the pain point is not just on the healthcare provider side. That's the perspective I came from. So that's where I usually speak from my own experience. But I know that there's just as much pain on the vendor side, and that is precisely why CORL Cleared exists.
Well, thanks, guys. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. If you'd like to learn more, please reach out to CORL and HITRUST to schedule a consultation. As mentioned, we'll follow up if we didn't make it to your question. I want to thank all of you for joining today, and a special thanks to our speakers, Ryan and Britton.
Thanks. Good
Thanks,
job,
everyone.